The lines were long. Voters wore masks and gloves. And nearly a week after Wisconsin had people go to the polls in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, despite closing hundreds of precincts, the results are expected to arrive on Monday evening.
County and municipal clerks cannot report results until 4 p.m. Central Time because of a court order that extended the deadline for returning absentee ballots, but they have been allowed to do some of the work of processing votes already, which could speed up the reporting process tonight.
Election officials are able to feed ballots into optical scanners now, and until the deadline for ballots to arrive, said Reed Magny, a spokesman for the Wisconsin Elections Commission. What they cannot do until 4 p.m. is create a report of the results.
Here's what to watch for when the results come in.
At the last minute, Gov. Tony Evers, a Democrat, dropped his previous insistence that he did not have the power to change the election date without the consent of the Republican-controlled state legislature. Mr. Evers tried to mail absentee ballots to all voters or move the primary given the pandemic, but the state Supreme Court, which is controlled by conservative justices, overturned the governor's effort.
Now the balance of power on the court itself is at stake, with a conservative incumbent justice, Daniel Kelly, facing off against a liberal challenger, Jill Karofsky. The court is technically nonpartisan, but a victory for Mr. Kelly would preserve what has been the court's 5-2 conservative advantage.
That is arguably the most important contest from last Tuesday's balloting, with the winner in a position to decide a case before the court that could purge more than 200,000 people from the Wisconsin vote rolls in a critical battleground swing state for the presidential campaign.
The court seat is significant enough that President Trump weighed in on Twitter, praising Mr. Kelly as a jurist who loves your military, vets, farmers.
Wisconsin will be the final state to have voted before Senator Bernie Sanders withdrew from the 2020 Democratic race for president, making former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. the party's presumptive nominee. Mr. Sanders endorsed Mr. Biden on Monday afternoon.
Mr. Sanders actually carried Wisconsin in 2016. He won all but one county that year in his insurgent bid against Hillary Clinton, but he is expected to fare far worse against Mr. Biden this year.
The presidential primary results, even for an election held mid-pandemic, are likely to be closely scrutinized ahead of November, for relative pockets of Mr. Biden's strengths and weaknesses in a state that some project could be the tipping point of the entire presidential race.
Recent polls in Wisconsin have shown Mr. Biden with a narrow lead over Mr. Trump, often within the margin of error.
The number of polling stations in Milwaukee shrank to only 5 from about 180. Some voters in the city, which has the biggest minority population in the state, waited for more than 2 hours to vote, staying 6 feet apart to the extent that they could. But in some other parts of the state, many of which are whiter, voting was not nearly as disrupted, with the addition of options that included curbside ballot access.
Many who waited in line to fulfill their democratic duties were filled with fear.
They say they don't want you to get sick, but then they send you out here in the damn crowd, Lawrence Johnson, a 70-year-old cleaning worker, said while in line. One woman became a symbol while holding a homemade, "This is ridiculous" sign.
A big question surrounding the results is how low and depressed Milwaukee's turnout was relative to other parts of the state.
A number of civic groups and attorneys have been closely watching the election with an eye toward litigation.
First to the courthouse were Jay Urban and Joseph Good, two Milwaukee lawyers who filed suit in federal court in Madison on Monday against state officials, even before the election results were known.
The plaintiffs in their case are 14 Wisconsin residents, many of whom skipped voting last week because of health concerns.
One Milwaukee couple identified in the case, Crystal and Teron Edwards, are typical of the plaintiffs. Mr. Edwards is diabetic. Of their 3 children, one has spina bifida and another asthma.
The Edwardses, who routinely vote, requested absentee ballots, but they never arrived. The Edwards did not vote in person in the spring election due to health and safety concerns of illness and death, for themselves, their family, and the community, the lawsuit says.
At least 9,000 ballots requested by Wisconsin voters were never sent out, and other voters told The New York Times last week that they never received their ballots even though they were recorded as sent.
Maggie Astor and Stephanie Saul contributed reporting.